Part 1, Chapter 5 of Family Happiness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Family Happiness by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. Part 1, Chapter 5. There was no reason for postponing our wedding, and neither of us desired such a thing. To be sure, Katya was anxious to go to Moscow and order a trousseau, and his mother urged him to get a new carriage and furniture and have the house furnished with new hangings before he should marry. But we both decided that it would be better to attend to all these things afterwards, if indeed they were so necessary, and accordingly the wedding was celebrated a fortnight after my birthday, without a trousseau, without guests, without groomsmen, without a supper and champagne and all those conventional accessories of a wedding. He told me how annoyed his mother was to have the marriage ceremony performed without music, without a mountain of trunks, and a complete renovation of the house, so different from her wedding, which cost 30,000 roubles, and how she was solemnly making a secret search through the trunks in her storeroom, and taking Maryushka the housekeeper into consultation in regard to certain rugs, curtains, and salvers indispensable for our felicity. In my house, Katya did the same with the old nurse Kuzminishna, and it was of no use to speak with her in respect to this, otherwise than seriously. She was firmly convinced that when Sergyei Mikhailitch and I were talking over our future, we were merely talking soft sentimentalities and behaving foolishly, as people in such conditions are usually supposed to do, but that our material happiness in the future would depend upon the regular cut and embroidery of my underwear, and the hemming of tablecloths and napkins. Between Pokrovskaya and Nikolskaya, mysterious messages were exchanged several times each day, respecting various preparations, and, although outwardly Katya and his mother seemed to be on the most affectionate footing, still their intercourse began to be conducted in accordance with a subtle but somewhat hostile diplomacy. Tatyana Semyonovna, his mother, with whom I now became much more closely acquainted, was a precise, stern mistress of the manner, and a lady of the old school. He loved her, not only as a son, for duty's sake, but also as a man, through his intellect, regarding her as the very best, most intelligent, kindest, and most lovable woman in the world. Tatyana Semyonovna had always been kind to us, and to me especially, and she was glad that her son was going to marry me, but when I had visited her after my betrothal, it seemed to me that she was anxious to make me understand that I was not after all the best match for her son, and that it was well for me never to forget it. But I entirely understood her and agreed with her. During the last 2 weeks of my maidenhood we saw each other every day. He came to dinner and stayed till midnight. But, in spite of his declaration that he could not live without me, and I knew he spoke the truth, he never spent a whole day without me, and tried still to give some attention to his affairs. Our outward relations continued up to the very day of the wedding, the same as before. We still addressed each other formally with vous, you, but he did not even kiss my hand, and not only did not seek, but even avoided opportunities of being alone with me. He really seemed to be afraid that the affection which was in his heart would become too overmastering and injurious. I cannot tell, either he or I had changed, and now I felt that I stood on the same footing with him. I no longer found in him that affectation of simplicity which had formerly displeased me, and oftentimes I saw before me, instead of a man inspiring respect and awe, a sweet child spoiled with happiness. There is nothing so surprisingly great in him, I often said to myself. He is simply a human being, just as I am, nothing more. It now seemed to me that there was nothing hidden from me, that I knew him thoroughly, and all that I saw of him was so simple and so congenial to me. Even his plans for our future mode of life coincided with mine, only they were expressed more clearly and admirably in his words. The weather these days was wretched, and we spent most of the time in the house. Our best and most intimate talks were held between the piano and the window. The candlelight was reflected in the window panes, against which, now and again, fell the raindrops and trickled down. The rain beat on the roof and poured from the spout into the pool, the dampness spread over the window. And how much brighter, warmer, and more cheerful from very contrast it seemed in our corner. "Do you know, I have for a long time wanted to tell you one thing," said he, as we were sitting late one evening in this place. "I have been thinking about it all the time that you were playing." "Do not tell me anything, I know it all," said I. "Yes, you are right, we will say nothing about it." "Oh, but tell me, what were you going to say?" I asked. "Well, this was it. Do you remember when I told you the story about A and B? The idea of not remembering that stupid story. It's well that it ended as it did. Yes, a little more and I should have ruined my own happiness. You saved me. But the main thing was that I was telling a falsehood all the time, and my conscience pricks me, and I wish to finish telling it. "Oh, please, it's not necessary." "Don't be alarmed," said he with a smile. "All I wish is to set myself right in your eyes. When I began to speak I wanted to reason." "Reason? What for?" I exclaimed. "It is never necessary." "Yes, I reason badly. After all my disillusions, my mistakes in life, when I came to live in the country I resolutely told myself that love, for me, was at an end, that all that was left to me was the duty of living out my remnant of life, and it was long before I realized what my feelings were toward you, and where they were leading me. I hoped and despaired. Sometimes it seemed to me that you were playing the coquette. Then again my faith returned, and actually I did not know what I should do. But after that evening, you remember, don't you, when we walked through the garden that moonlight night? I was filled with alarm. My happiness then seemed to me too great, seemed to exceed the bounds of possibility. Well, what would have happened to me if I had allowed myself to hope and found that it was in vain? But, of course, I thought only of myself, because I'm a miserable egotist." He stopped talking and looked at me. However, it was not absolute nonsense that I spoke at that time, for you see there was a good reason for me to fear. I receive so much from you and can give so little in return. You are still only a child, you're a bud which is yet to unfold. You love for the first time, while I— "Yes, tell me all the truth about it," said I, but suddenly I felt overmastered by a sudden terror at what his answer might be. "No, no, it is not necessary," I added. "Whether I have ever loved before, you mean?" he exclaimed, instantly divining my thought. "I can tell you about it. No, I have never loved before. Never have I experienced such a feeling as this." But suddenly some painful memory seemed to flash through his mind. "No, and just here is where I need a heart like yours in order to have the right to love you," said he, gloomily. "Was it not necessary, therefore, for me to think it all over before telling you that I loved you? What is there for me to give you? Love, that is true." "Is that little?" I asked, looking him in the eyes. "Little, my dear, little for you," he continued. "You are young and beautiful. I often now cannot sleep at night, I am so happy, and because I keep thinking how we are going to live together. I've had many experiences in life, and it seems to me that I have now found all that is essential for happiness. The quiet, lonely life in our country solitude, with the possibility of being benefactors to people to whom it is easy to do good, and who are so unaccustomed to it. Then work which brings its own reward, then rest, nature, one's books, music, love for some congenial spirit. Such is my ideal of happiness, and I cannot conceive of a higher. And then, above all, such a friend as you are, a family perhaps, and all that any man could desire in this world." "Yes," said I. "For me, since I have lived out my youth, yes, but not for you," he went on to say. "You have not as yet seen anything of life. You very likely have still some desire to seek happiness in another sphere, and perhaps you would find it. It seems to you now that this is happiness because you love me." "No, this quiet home happiness has always been my aim and ambition," said I, "and you have simply expressed what I have always thought." He smiled. "It only seems so to you, my dear. This is little to you. You are young and beautiful," he repeated thoughtfully. But I was annoyed because he did not believe me, and because he, as it were, made my youth and beauty a reproach. "Then why do you love me?" I asked angrily. "For my beauty or for myself?" "I don't know, but I love you," he replied, looking at me with his keen, fascinating glance. I made no answer, and could not help looking into his eyes. Suddenly something strange took place in me. First I ceased to see all surrounding objects, then his face disappeared from before me. His eyes alone seemed to be gleaming in front of my eyes. Then it seemed to me that those eyes took possession of me. Then everything grew dim and everything faded from my sight, and I had to shut my eyes in order to get rid of the sense of passionate bliss and terror which that glance of his gave me. On the eve of the day set for the wedding, late in the afternoon the weather cleared, and after the rains which had begun while it was still summer, we had our first clear, cool autumn evening. Everything was wet, cool, and bright, and now, for the first time, the garden began to open out its vistas through the autumnal colouring of the leaves that already had begun to fall. The sky was clear, cool, and pale. I went to bed happy in the thought that the day of our wedding should be fair. On that day I woke with the sun, and the thought that the time had come, as it were, frightened me, and filled me with fear and wonder. I went down into the garden. The sun had only just risen, and was shining through the thin yellow foliage of the linden trees that shaded the walk. The path was strewn with rustling leaves. The wrinkled, bright clusters of berries on the mountain ash gleamed red on the branches, where still hung a few crumpled leaves killed by the frost. The dahlias stood shriveled and black. Frost, for the first time, lay like silver across the pale green grass, and on the broken burdocks near the house. On the clear, cool sky not a single cloud was or could be seen. Can it be today? I ask myself, not daring to believe in my happiness. Can it be that I shall wake up tomorrow not here, but in that strange house at Nikolskaya, with its pillars? Is it possible that I shall no longer have to wait for his coming, no more be going out to meet him, talk no longer about him with Katya? Shall I no more sit with him in the piano in our Pokrovskaya drawing-room? Shall I no more see him to the door and worry about him when the nights are dark? But then I remembered he had told me the evening before that he had come for the last time, and Katya had called me to try on my wedding dress, and said, "It is for tomorrow," and for a moment I really realized it and again doubted. Can it be that after today I'm going to live there with my husband's mother, without Nadezhda, without old Grigory, without Katya? Shall I no longer kiss my nurse good night and have her, according to old custom, make the sign of the cross over me and say, "Good night, Barishnya"? I shall no longer teach Sonia and play with her and knock on the wall for her in the morning and hear her ringing laughter. Must I today be changed into another person, a stranger to myself? And is a new life, the realizations of my hopes and desires opening out before me? Will this new life last forever? I waited impatiently for him to come. It was hard for me to be alone with these thoughts. He came early, and only when I saw him did I really believe that this day I was to be his wife, and ceased to tremble at the thought. Before dinner we went to our chapel to offer a mass in memory of my father. If he were only alive now, I thought, as we were returning home, and I silently leaned on the arm of the man who had been the warmest friend of him whom I was thinking. During the prayer, while I knelt with my forehead pressed to the cold stones of the chapel floor, I recalled my father so vividly, I had such a firm belief that his spirit was cognizant of me and approved of my choice, that it seemed to me as though even now it were hovering over us and giving us his blessing. And recollections and hopes and happiness and grief mingled within me in one triumphant and delicious feeling, which was still further intensified by the calm, fresh air, the calmness, the wide bare fields, the pale sky, from which fell over all things bright but gentle rays, striving to kindle the colour in my cheeks. It seemed to me that the man who was by my side understood and shared my feeling. He walked quietly and silently, and his face, into which I looked from time to time, expressed the same serious emotion, which was neither grief nor joy, and which was both in nature and in my heart. Suddenly he turned to me, and I saw that he had something in his mind to say. It occurred to me, suppose he should not speak of what I am thinking? But he spoke of my father, though he did not even speak of him by name. Once he said to me in jest, "You must marry my Masha." These were his words. How happy he would be now, said I, warmly pressing the arm on which I leaned. Yes, you were then only a child, he went on to say, looking into my eyes. I used to kiss those eyes, and loved them only because they were like his, and I had no thought then that they would be for their own sake so dear to me. I called you Masha then. Say thou to me, said I. That is what I have wished, he went on, but only now does it seem possible to me that thou art wholly mine. And his calm, happy, fascinating glance rested on me. And we walked still without hurrying along the field path, scarcely traceable amid the trampled piles of stubble. Our footsteps and our voices alone broke the silence. On one side, beyond the ravine, stretched away toward the distant forest, now stripped of leaves, the brown stubble field, where, not far from us, a peasant with his rude plough was noiselessly marking a black strip that grew constantly wider and wider. The drove of horses, scattered at the foot of the hill, seemed close at hand. On the other side, and straight ahead of us, the dark field of winter wheat, touched by the frost, and marked here and there with greenish patches, stretched away clear up to the garden and the house which could be seen rising directly behind it. Everything was bathed in the autumnal rays of the sun. Long filaments of cobwebs stretched in every direction. They floated through the air around us and hung over the field dried by the frost. They got into our eyes and clung to our hair and our garments. When we spoke, our voices were resonant, and seemed to hover over us in the motionless atmosphere, as though we were alone in the midst of the great world, and alone under the blue arch, over which played an unscorching sun, flashing and trembling. I also wanted to use the familiar "ti," thou, to him, but I felt abashed. "Why dost thou walk so fast?" I asked, hurrying over the words and almost whispering them, and feeling the blood rush to my face. He slackened his pace and looked still more affectionately, still more gaily and joyfully at me. When we reached the house, his mother and the guests whom we could not avoid asking were already assembled, and, up to the moment when, on leaving the church, we took our seats in the carriage to ride to Nikolskaya, I was no longer alone with him. The church was almost empty. I saw out of the corner of my eye only his mother, standing prim and precise on the carpeting in the choir, Katya in her cap with lilac ribbons, and with tears on her cheeks, and 2 or 3 house serfs who had been attracted by curiosity and came to stare at me. I did not look at him, but I was conscious of his presence near me. I listened to the words of the prayers and repeated them with my lips, but there seemed to be no echo of them in my soul. I could not pray. I looked stupidly at the icons, the tapers, the embroidered cross on the back of the priest's chasuble, at the ikonistas, the church windows, and everything was like a dream. I only had a confused consciousness that something extraordinary was taking place in me. When the priest with the cross turned to us and congratulated us, and said that he had christened me, and now God had granted him the privilege of marrying me, when Katya and his mother kissed us, and Grigori's voice was heard as he drove up the carriage, I was amazed and frightened, because it was all over and nothing extraordinary had taken place in my soul, nothing that had corresponded to the mysterious sacrament which had been performed over me. He and I exchanged kisses, and this kiss was so strange, so alien to our feelings. Is that all? I asked myself. We went to the church porch. The wheels echoed with a hollow sound under the vaulted roof. My face was fanned by the cool breeze. He put on his hat and handed me into the carriage. From the carriage window I saw the crescent of the frosty moon. He took his seat next me, and shut the door. Something throbbed in my heart. The self-assurance with which he did this seemed to me insulting. Katya's voice screamed something about protecting my head. The wheels struck against a stone, and then we turned into the smooth road and were off. Throwing myself back in one corner, I looked out of the window on the distant fields and the road, seeming to reflect a pale light from the chill rays of the moon. And, though I did not look at him, I felt the consciousness that he was next to me. And is this all that the moment for which I have waited so anxiously has to give me? I asked myself, and it began to appear mean and humiliating to sit alone so near to him. I turned to him with the intention of saying something, but no word found utterance. It was as though there were in me none of that former feeling of affection, and as though humiliation and dismay had taken its place. Till this moment I have not been able to persuade myself that this was to be, he softly murmured in reply to my look. Yes, but somehow or other it is terrible to me, I replied. Am I terrible to you? He asked, taking my hand and raising it to his lips. My hand lay lifelessly in his, and in my heart there was a sense of painful coldness. Yes, I whispered. But then suddenly my heart began to beat more violently. My hand trembled and suddenly pressed his hand. A feeling of warmth came over me. My eyes tried to look into his, in the twilight, and I suddenly felt that I was not afraid of him, that this dismay was love, new and vastly more tender and strong than before. I felt that I was wholly his, and that I was happy in his sovereignty over me. End of Part 1, Chapter 5.